the tattletale sun, and away broke over the river. And every man knew as the captain did too, 'twas the witch of November come stealing.
Another Shipwreck Tale with John McCrystal. This week, the Essex. We've said this about a few, and not without reason, but the Essex really is a standout, isn't it, John McCrystal?
Yes, it is. It's not that well known to most people as the Essex, but it is very well known to most people as the Pequod, I guess, because this was the inspiration for one of the great books in English literature, Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. He recognised when he heard the story told second-hand by the son of one of the survivors that here was one of the great stories of the sea, and he proceeded to write it down, and it became one of the great novels of the sea. There wasn't huge loss of life. It had a bit of a freakish event at its bottom, but in the end, it was just a great story.
And it goes on and on and on till the very end of some of the poor wretches' lives that went through this. It is true that a sperm whale rammed a whaler and sunk it.
Yeah, the descriptions of that, which we'll come to shortly, are amazing because it sounds so deliberate. And there are a number of survivors' reports of this incident, and they differ in some particulars, and some of them are quite important particulars. But the eyewitnesses to the central event, the ramming of the ship by a sperm whale, are pretty consistent. This thing seems to have worked out who was giving its pod grief, and it decided it was going to do something about it. These days, of course, it's hard not to go, yay, whale, but on the other hand...
This is a Nantucket whaleship. This is a story out of New England in the United States.
These Nantucket whalers went all the way around the world, and they kicked around here. I actually spent some time on Cape Foulwind recently digging up a piece of ship which may or may not be a whale ship from that part of the world. She was small. In those days, Nantucket whalers had to be small because there are sandbars at the entrance to the harbour. Anything too big just wouldn't get out. So they tended to be quite small. Even so, the Essex was quite a small whaler by contemporary standards. She was 238 tonnes, which is 87 feet or 27 metres long, so that's pretty small. If you think of the Spirit of New Zealand, which a lot of people have seen around, she's roughly the same displacement, but she's almost twice the length. So halve the Spirit of New Zealand and make her sort of tubby and ungainly looking. She was serving three purposes, really. She was a mothership for a small fleet of whale boats. She was oil tanker, and she was a factory ship because she not only had to catch the whales, she couldn't do that herself, so the little whale boats she carried did that. She had great big furnace aboard with great big iron pots, which they boiled the whales down to turn them into oil with, and then of course they shoved that oil in barrels and stored that down below. She was like a small truck of the ocean.
Right.
Yeah, it's a crude business, really. You've got a whale boat, which is an 8.5 metre long boat. It's 28 feet. It's clinker built. People will be aware it's where the planks sort of overlap like weatherboards. And they're not that watertight boats that are constructed like that. They're pretty easy to throw together, and they require less framing, and they can be built light and fast. So you've got one of these. You've got people rowing it. That was your motive power. And you've got a guy standing in the bow with a barrel with a whole lot of rope attached to a harpoon. And it's his job, when you rowed close enough to the whale, to throw it into the back of the whale, whereupon the rope rips out of the barrel, and then eventually it reaches its limit. By this stage, there are kegs and things attached to it to float. And so the whale is basically dragging around this dead weight in the water and exhausts itself. Once it's done that, the whale boat again approaches and a lance is shoved into the poor animal to kill it. They tie it up, drag it back to the ship, and then cut it to bits and melt it down. But that business of going up to one of these enormous creatures and throwing a piece of steel into it and making yourself fast to the whale was the term. Tying yourself to the whale, basically. The whale was not happy. The whale was trying to get away, and it was thrashing around in pain. So you're in the immediate vicinity of all that going on. Little wonder that these boats quite routinely got smashed to pieces by stroppy whales. She was an unlucky ship anyway. By the time she'd reached the Pacific, she'd spent 5 weeks trying to get around Cape Horn, which even by the standards of the day was pretty bad going. But she made it into the Pacific. She had no luck catching many whales. She only got about 24 on the South American coast. But she heard from other whalers that the Central Pacific was where the sperm whales hung out at this time of year. So she decided she'd have a crack at them, but she needed to reprovision. So she went to the Galapagos Islands, which of course are extremely important in terms of the number of distinct wildlife they have there. They hung out at a couple of the islands, and on one of them, one of the crew members decided that he would set a little bit of a fire as a bit of a lark. apparently that took off, and by the time they left about 2 days later and sailed over the horizon, they could still see the fire burning.
Good God.
It's reckoned that there were 2 species on that island that fire very much helped towards extinction. Meanwhile, of course, provisioning, they were just picking up Galapagos tortoises, those great, big, huge, lumbering animals. They can live for hundreds of years. One of them that Charles Darwin picked up from there was still alive at the end of last century. They were great for sailors in those days because you could stack them upside down in the hold alive. They don't move around. When they're upside down, they can't get up. They can live for about a year without water or food, which is ideal because it's basically food on the hoof. These guys got 300 for their little whaling jaunt to snack on while they were whaling out in the Central Pacific.
Let's mention some of the central characters, because the captain, the inspiration for the captain in Moby-Dick.
Captain Ahab in Moby-Dick, of course, is an old, grizzled fellow who's been chasing the white whale all around the oceans. The real captain of this vessel, the captain of the Essex, was George Pollard, a Nantucket fellow. He's only 29, which is incredible. And in fact, even at the day, that was pretty young to be commanding a whale ship. There were 21 members on the crew, and they were all young. The first mate, who becomes pretty famous in the story, a man by the name of Owen Chase, he was only 23. Most of the rest were probably around that age. There were 2 very young people aboard, and the youngest was Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, who was 15. They're just boys, really, out there on this ship doing this dangerous work, but that was what Nantucket specialised in.
And a lot of black sailors as well.
Yeah, there were. There were 6 Negroes aboard, and that again was not unusual. It was not a widespread acceptance of the full citizenship or the full humanity even of African Americans in those days, but Nantucket was a bit different because they were Quakers, and that particular religious sect was always against slavery and against any notion of racism. They believed that all human beings were equal, so Negroes often found work on Nantucket whale ships, and there were 6 aboard the Essex.
And it would end up that they wish they weren't. They found this whaling ground. Now they are east of South America. It's a long way away, isn't it?
It is. They sailed 2,500 nautical miles from the coast of South America, nearly 4,000 kilometres, halfway across the Pacific Ocean. This is a tiny ship to be way out there. They happen across a pod of whales, and in the process of making fast to one of these, Owen Chase's boat is smashed to smithereens by the tail flukes of an angry whale. That was a bit of bad luck. That was on the 16th of November.
How did he survive that?
Well, apparently there was quite a good survival rate. Everyone just more or less expected that when you went after a whale, you'd probably come back without your whaleboat. So you'd have your boat completely smashed around you, but apparently it was quite rare for people to be killed in that way.
And then on November the 20th, there she blows.
There she blows from the masthead. Yeah. And of course the captain would yell out, "Where away?" Whereupon the direction would be given and they'd sail down to try to intercept the whale pod. So they threw their 3 remaining boats in the water and they rowed like crazy to try to catch these whales.
We'll take a break and come back and hear about this extraordinary attack of a sperm whale against the Essex. And listeners, the story just starts there, unlike the Moby-Dick story, for which this story was the inspiration.
If Radio Live, it's Graham Hill's Weekend Variety Wireless.
Shipwreck Tales with John McCrystal. We're talking the wreck of the Essex, and the wrecking is just the beginning of the story, really. It was the inspiration for Moby-Dick. It's a whaler, and this extraordinary event, well recorded, of a very large sperm whale, which was being pursued by the whaler, turning on the ship and wrecking it. Tell us how it happened and how it was described, John McCrystal.
We've got 3 whale boats in the water. They're 28-foot boats and they're being rowed like fury after sperm whales, which are surfacing periodically. They get amongst them and all 3 boats make fast to whales. The captain and the second mate, both in command of a boat each, they disappear towards the horizon on the famous Nantucket sleigh ride, being dragged along by a whale. Chase gets fast to a whale, but it swings its tail around and smashes a big hole in the midships of his boat. So he immediately cuts it free, and that whale swims off with a harpoon sticking out of it somewhere. They manage, by shoving jackets in the hole in the boat and rowing like crazy and bailing like crazy, to make it back to the ship. Once aboard, Chase decides that he'll sail the ship in the direction of the receding captain and second mate. Meanwhile, he tries furiously repairing his boat. While he's doing that, his attention is drawn to a sperm whale which has surfaced only 100 yards away from the ship. And it's about the same length as the ship. They estimated it was maybe 2 feet shorter. So that's about 24 metres, an 85-foot whale, which is bigger than most sperm whales. It's lying on the surface, and it appears to them that it's eyeing them, it's looking at them. And then it swings around, dives shallowly, begins gathering speed, and comes straight towards them. And they watch, being unable to do anything, including believing what they're seeing, and it smashes into the side of the ship, just behind the bow. It goes underneath, and then surfaces on the leeward side, apparently a bit stunned, and just lies there for a while. Then it suddenly revives about a minute later and swims off again. And they see it turn around and do the same thing. It's just lying there and looking at them. It then thrashed around, possibly a little bit angry that it hadn't done the damage it intended to first time round, and it comes at them again, even faster. And this time it hits them directly. It's a head-on collision, the bow of the whale hitting the bow of the boat. And the bow of the boat isn't equal to the collision, and it's completely smashed in. The whale swims directly underneath the keel and rocks the boat around, such as the power of it, comes up on the leeward side for a moment and then disappears.
Has this incident been witnessed before or known of, heard of by the people on this ship?
No,
Right.
Although there are other reports, possibly scared out of the woodwork by this incident when it became known.
We have to be careful with anthropomorphizing, but whales aren't stupid, and this does seem deliberate. It's a spooky thing.
Very spooky, because some of these whales will have had experience of being hunted. They're not dumb. They will have associated the appearance of a keel in the water as bad news for them. And supposing this whale had had this experience before and saw members of its herd being injured deliberately, it may have thought it all comes back to that keel. When that appeared, that's where the problems began. So decided to take matters into its own fins.
This is a severely damaged ship. Its fate was set by the attack?
Yes, it became absolutely clear after the first collision that she was badly damaged, and Chase had ordered men to go and man the pumps. But within 10 minutes of the first collision, the ship's gone. They have managed to repair their whaleboat to a degree of watertightness and shoved it in the water. They've slung everything they can grab aboard, which is 2 sets of important navigational gear. By the time they're aboard their little boat, the Essex is underwater. She's rolled over and she's pretty much waterlogged. They had hoisted the signal for the recall of the other 2 boats, but whether that was seen, who knows. But eventually, the captain and the second mate came back. They couldn't help but notice the absence of the ship. Apparently the captain went pale, as you would, sank down onto the seat. He was standing up as they approached. Took him a while, but then after a while he got the power of speech back, whereupon he called out, "By God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" Whereupon Chase yelled, "We have been stove by a whale. The ship is gone." You have to feel for them, really. They are about as far into the Pacific as it's possible to get, and they have lost their only means of getting back, their only reliable means of getting back.
Did they manage to salvage much from the ship, from the flotsam?
The ship stayed intact and retained a little bit of buoyancy, as a wooden ship will do, especially when it rolls, because a lot of air is trapped in the hull at that point. In many ways, they miscalculated a little bit. They hovered around for too long. They spent 2 or 3 days actually in the vicinity of the wreck, just hoping, I think, that something good would come of doing that. Not psychologically ready, I think, to set out on a massive boat journey in these 3 frail boats. But they weren't idle while they were there. They cut holes in the hull where they knew there were provisions. They managed to get about 600 pounds of what they call hard bread, which is basically cabin bread or water crackers. They got 3 65-gallon kegs of water, so 1 per boat. Just by chance, they happened across 2 pounds of nails and a few planks, and they threw those aboard in case they were useful. There were a couple of Galapagos turtles around, so they grabbed those. And they had a musket and a couple of pistols, and a few other odds and ends, but that basically is all they had. They salvaged some spars and some canvas and set about making masts and sail for their boats, which are normally powered only by oars.
How many people in how many boats?
1 crew member had deserted back on the coast of South America, so they have 20 people between the 3 boats, more or less evenly divided. 1 boat's under the command of Pollard, 1 under the command of Chase, the first mate, and 1 under the command of Hendricks, the second mate.
All right. What is the plan with 3 boats? Stay together?
They had a debate. The obvious thing was to stay together, because if 1 boat struck trouble, they could divide the crew of that boat between the others. Where to go? Where do they go? They're in the central Pacific around the vicinity of the equator, and it's the trade wind season, so the wind is trying to push them east. They don't want to go there because they know about the Society Islands and the Friendly Islands, but by reputation, those places are populated by cannibals. They're afraid of being cannibalised, which becomes rather ironic. Okay. So they decide they can't head east. They decide their best chance is to head west and into the vicinity of the main whaling grounds. They briefly consider the Marquesas, which are directly the closest landfall, even though they're 1,200 nautical miles to the west. But again, the fear of cannibalism holds them back. So the decision is they will head south to try to pick up the westerlies that we've talked about often. So they need to go south and then they want to go west. They're going to sail a sort of a circle route to get back towards the coast of South America. The hope, of course, is that they're going to strike another whaler on her way out into the region where they are. But that's a pretty forlorn hope.
Did they tether the boats together? Because it's easy to get separated.
Yeah, they tethered the boats together, but 3 days later they struck a storm. No, in fact, it was the next day. They struck a storm. Not only were all three boats pretty badly swamped, but the tethering broke. Somehow they managed to stay together, but it wasn't by being tied together. It was just by sheer vigilance. The worst consequence of this storm is that half their provisions were soaked with salt water. Water crackers just hoovered up that salt water and basically turned into one of the more efficient ways of administering salt water to yourself that you could find. They weren't flush for water, so every time they ate one of these biscuits, they just got a massive thirst. They couldn't do anything about that with their fresh water supplies. They rationed their food and their water right from the start, but needless to say, as time went by, they had to cut those rations. This problem with the salt contamination of most of their food just really exacerbated their problems.
How long are they before there is any relief?
Well, there's no relief for a very long time, put it that way. And in fact, while they're drifting, they've also got the basic unseaworthiness of these vessels to contend with as well. After that storm that I mentioned, Chase's boat sprang a leak, and it was a major leak. It was making water faster than they could bail. They discovered they could stay afloat if they all sat on the gunwale and canted the boat so far over that whatever the affected part of the boat was out of the water. The captain's boat noticed this and rowed across and saw that one of their planks had sprung. So by passing over a hatchet and one of these nails that, as an afterthought, they'd thrown aboard, that plank was made fast again and the boat was a little bit more watertight. On the 28th of November, so 6 days after abandoning, a great big shark in the middle of the night came up and started nibbling on the captain's boat. They tried whacking it around the head with a spar, but it didn't seem too interested in that. In fact, munched a few bits off the spar, and then eventually just lost interest and drifted away. But they reckon that was about a 12-foot animal. They didn't know whether it was a shark or a whale, but I presume at that length it has to have been a shark. They described it as one of the species of killer fish.
Okay.
So they're sharing the water with some pretty scary killer fish.
We'll take a break and continue with this epic story of the Essex, 1820, rammed and sunk by a whale, no less, the inspiration for Moby-Dick.
Radio Live. It's Graham Hill's Weekend Variety Wireless.
Shipwreck Tale with John McCrystal. The Essex has been rammed and sunk by a sperm whale. Far out. 3 whale boats with 20 men trying to survive, really in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean. Thirst, of course, thirst and hunger. Take us from there, John.
The worst thing for them was thirst, because, as I've mentioned, they were eating salt-contaminated food, which was exacerbating the fact that they had very little fresh water. They're basically on the brink, really, of dying of thirst. They're rinsing their mouths with salt water and they're drinking their own urine, neither of which is actually providing any meaningful relief. It's not rehydrating them. But then, miraculously as it seems, on the 20th of December, they sighted land. They were all half dead, but suddenly they were able to row and to handle their boats again. And they get ashore on this thing that they identify as Ducie Island. It's a lump of coral from a shattered atoll. It's got vegetation, but...
It's Henderson Island today, isn't it?
Well, they thought it was Ducie Island, not Henderson Island, funnily enough. Henderson Island isn't marked on any charts they would have consulted on their journey. They didn't have charts on the boat journey. They were going by things called navigators. It's odds on that Henderson Island wasn't marked. This little thing called Ducie Island was. They thought they were 200 kilometres away from where they actually were. They were actually on Henderson Island.
Google Earth it, listeners. It's a fascinating looking little island, and it's amazing just to imagine them rowing ashore there.
It's 140 kilometres away from Pitcairn, and had they known about Pitcairn, or had they actually known where they were, they may have made for Pitcairn. But in any case, here they are fetched up on Henderson Island, mistakenly thinking it's Ducie Island. Job number 1 is have a look for water, and that's what they do. They scour the island looking for it. A slight seep of fresh water is located on a rock right on the foreshore, but nothing else, no matter where they go. They spend a couple of days there just fruitlessly searching for water, basically stripping it of anything they can eat. Turns out some of the grass is edible. It's like a watercress, and so they scoff that. There are crabs, there's the odd bird, but it's not flush with food either. Owen Chase digs a huge hole around this rock where the seep has been detected, but he can't get even a cupful to gather in the hole. And then, just as he's laid himself down on the beach and decided that the end has come, he sees a few blokes cheerfully carrying a water keg past him, and he thinks this can mean only one thing. This is a genuine 24-carat miracle, this one. When the tide went out, it was discovered there was a spring below the high water mark in a hole in the rock, and someone stumbled across this. At low tide, they're able to fill up their water kegs and they're able to drink their fill of water.
You know, with that level of thirst, you'd probably smell it.
You probably would. You'd try any piece of standing water just in case, I would think.
What a red-letter day for these poor castaways.
Absolutely. So death is averted, but it's clear that it's not far away because their food is basically run out. They managed to knock off the odd fish or whatever here, but basically they've stripped the place. So the idea is they have to press on. They decide they'll head for Easter Island now, but 3 men decide they won't go. They decide that they can make enough of a living and they've got water, and they're damned if they're going to get back in those whale boats.
It's as if fortune is just playing with them, keeping them alive, giving them a little bit of luck just to see them suffer again and have to move on.
Absolutely. Some of the crew considered themselves to be an unlucky ship by the time they were rounding the Horn. By the time they got home, I think they would have been fairly confirmed in that opinion.
So what is the division of those that leave Henderson Island because it has no resources other than the fresh water, and those that decide to stay behind?
I'm not clear as to why these 3 are left behind. It could be significant that the 3 were white, but they were not from Nantucket. 2 were Massachusetts, 1 was an Englishman. 1 of them came from each boat. It sounds and it looks as though a deliberate decision were made to put 3 people off, just to give the rest the best possible chance.
Okay.
That's the way I read it. Nothing I've read has actually said as much. They decided they just weren't going to go. I just find it a little bit significant that when the 3 boats are ready to go, there's no sign of these 3 guys. So Owen Chase goes looking for them, and he finds them huddled in a cave and just not willing to come and say goodbye.
I can imagine their reticence at getting in that bloody boat again, given the horrors of getting to Henderson Island. But
yeah, I would rather die on dry land, I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. If the other guys get rescued, your chances of getting rescued from the rock improve. If they don't get rescued, then they're going to die a worse death than you, I submit.
Okay.
So yeah, they chose right.
Nonetheless, they take off.
Yep, they take off. So we've got about 15 guys now spread across these 3 boats. And of course, they're aiming for Easter Island, which is still a massive, massive sail. Unfortunately, they make a lot of leeway. There's a current running and their navigation isn't precise, so they overshoot Easter Island. They go too far south. And it's going to be too hard to get back there. So their only real option now is to aim for an island called Maza Tierra Island, which is off the coast of Chile. It's, again, a huge sail away. But it's their best chance, and they know that that is in the main shipping and the main whaling ground, so it's their only shot. That decision was made on January the 4th. They have their first death on January the 10th, a man by the name of Matthew Joy. This guy, they rated as not starved to death, but just someone who hadn't exactly thrived aboard, and he just went downhill very fast, and obviously starvation, thirst didn't help, and they buried him at sea on January the 10th. They get separated the very next day. Chase has got 6 people aboard his boat. He wakes up in the morning and suddenly he sees that there's no sign of the captain's boat or the second mate's boat. He hunts around for a little while, which he's reluctant to do because there's no velocity made good towards their destination there. They're just wallowing. But he can't find them, so he decides he'll just stand on the agreed course and hope for the best.
Did they have enough water? Did they take enough from the spring?
Water ceased to be their immediate problem. Food became pretty critical. So they're not going to die of thirst before they die of starvation, put it that way.
So water's not a problem. This is just fortune tinkering with them again. The death is going to be long and drawn out, more than it would be had they died of thirst.
Yeah, you'd die of thirst sooner than you'd die of food if you had neither. They've got enough water to stave off the death from thirst, so they're going to suffer a lingering death from starvation.
When did they
And
run out of food?
They run out of food in Chase's boat on February the 1st. These become separate stories here. So February the 1st, Chase manages to run out. Hendricks's boat had run out earlier on January the 14th, and Pollard's on the 21st. So all in a cluster towards the end of January, early Feb. Okay. We know what happened aboard Chase's boat, beginning to suffer deaths. By this stage, there's only 3 of them left in Chase's boat because others have died of starvation. Instead of putting them over the side into the sea with a few appropriate words said the way they've done it previously, on the occasion of the death of the 3rd man, he proposed to his crewmates that instead of burying him at sea, they keep him for food. And as he puts it, they put up no resistance. This proposal was met with no resistance. So they cut him up and they began eating him. They decided that they'd try and dry the flesh from the body to last them a bit longer. Fate was toying with them. 2 days later, they noticed that the meat was going putrid. So they built a fire in their boat and cooked it in order to keep it a little longer. We know what happened aboard Pollard's boat. He ran out in late January. Again, they were cannibalising the dead, but even then, they weren't dying at a fast enough rate. So it was proposed that they draw lots to work out who would die so that the others would live. This is one of the most amazing episodes in human history, I reckon. They drew lots, so they had lengths of straw or something similar, and one of them had a black spot on it. They all drew them, and a young guy called Owen Coffin looked at his, and there was the black spot. He was a cousin of Captain Pollard, and Pollard said, "I'll protect you if you don't want this." And he said, "No, Captain, I like my lot as well as any other." So he surrendered himself to his fate. They drew lots again to work out who was going to shoot him, and it was a friend of his who drew the short straw on this occasion. So he shot him in the back of the head, then they proceeded to cut him up and cannibalise him. It's just an unbelievable story, it really is. The poor executioner died a couple of days later and he became food as well. It's just, yeah.
Okay.
What drives human beings this far? It beggars belief.
There are 3 boats. We know what happened to 2. That means one, the other boat, Obed Hendricks. What do we know of that boat if it was lost?
That boat became separated from the captain's boat on the 28th of January, and no one knows what happened in that boat. There were 3 aboard, and they've been lost to history. One interesting thing, those 2 boats, Pollard's boat and Hendricks's boat, between them, they had 3 people who died and were cannibalised in the relatively early stages after they ran out of food. They were all black. Again, I don't know what the dynamics are and what the social attitudes were, but it just seems a coincidence that 3 of the black guys ended up on the menu.
In these stories, it's never the first mate, is it, that draws the lot?
No, it's the weak and the vulnerable, it tends to be. The cabin boy's always in trouble. The cabin boy was aboard Chase's boat, and apparently he gave up all hope of being rescued. He probably imagined he was going to be on the menu. He would have heard the stories. And miraculously enough, just after he'd announced his intention to die and thrown a piece of canvas over himself in the bow of the boat, they saw a sail. So, quite remarkably, he was saved by the fact they were rescued.
We can imagine their condition at the rescue. Good heavens, hauling aboard a ship.
Yeah, Chase couldn't climb out of the boat. He got to his feet, but he promptly fell over again. He couldn't climb out. They had to be winched aboard. They were rescued by an English whaling ship, which apparently just plied them with every kindness, as you probably would, you would hope.
Now, Pollard's boat. This is one of the most extraordinary reports of the human condition. They do get rescued, of course, because we know their story, but what condition?
Yeah, Pollard's boat had a bit longer to go because Chase was rescued on the February the 18th. It was another 5 days before Pollard and Ramsdell, the only 2 left in that boat, were rescued by another Nantucket whaler, amazingly enough, captained by the cousin of Owen Coffin. The Dauphin, or Dauphin I guess the Americans would call it, rolled up, and apparently these 2 skeletal figures in the whaleboat didn't even recognise this as a ship. They stared at it without even knowing what it was. When they became aware that it was a ship, they became terrified of the people aboard. Who knows, perhaps that's because they were afraid of being eaten. Who knows, maybe it's because they were afraid of having been found to have eaten their shipmates. Either way, they apparently were just raving and terrified when they were plucked out of their little boat.
Well, I think perhaps their condition affects the brain as well. Who knows what they hallucinated.
Absolutely.
But to see that, if imagine you're aboard that ship and you see these poor wretches behaving like that, not even, staring into midair.
Yeah, it's just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
They dragged these guys out of the boat, and everyone's reunited in late February in Valparaiso in Chile.
You know, what I would really like to know is how their condition improved, minute by minute, aboard the boat, starting from gnawing on the bones and terrified by this ship, how they improved minute by minute, what they remembered of it,
Even water, just the abundance of water would have made a difference. There seems to have been a fair bit of common sense among sailors in those days about how you should restore your condition. Chase, when he was on Henderson Island, didn't immediately just guzzle water as a whole bunch of them did. They actually expected those who just flopped face down in the water and drank and drank and drank to die, because it was conventional wisdom that that's what happened. Apparently it didn't.
No.
But the others, the sensible ones, the ones who had a bit of self-control, just did it in sort of measured bursts. Presumably food was administered the same way for the same reason. But yeah, imagine how quickly the light would come back on in the eyes and the head would come up and what have you.
I wonder if they remember their rescue. I suppose they do. Yeah. Okay, we have to take a break. It's been a rough ride in these two boats. One lost to history. We can imagine what happened to them. But the survivors, just through cannibalism and the good luck of being rescued, are all brought together at Valparaiso. And we'll take the story from there. Of course, we have the other castaways still on Henderson Island.
Radio Live. It's Graham Hill's Weekend Variety Wireless.
The incredible tale of the Essex, rammed by a whale, the inspiration for Moby-Dick. But the story from there onwards is the incredible tale of, survival and death of those in the whaleboats. John, enormous privations, but a few have been rescued from their wretched boats in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, of the 20 who got away from the Essex, 5 have survived from the boats, and they're in Chile. They immediately inform the authorities that 3 of their mates are on Ducie Island, way off in towards the Central Pacific. An English whaler volunteers to go and have a look because she's bound that way. She reaches Ducie Island and hunts around fruitlessly. There's no one there. Luckily, the captain had heard from another whaling captain that there was another bit of rock 200 miles to the south of Ducie Island. And it's not on the chart, but he thinks he'll go and have a look anyway. So he goes down and he reaches what became known as Henderson Island, because Henderson was the man who supplied that information. Lo and behold, in a cave, pretty much at death's door, he finds these 3 guys and he takes them off. They had time to hunt around their island, and in another cave they found 8 skeletons apparently, all laid out quite neatly, as though everyone there had just laid down to die. And in fact, Owen Chase's book, which reveals this bit of information, has no further information on those people at all, but they've been quite well studied. It turns out there were 7 skeletons there, one of them of a child, and they were Caucasian of origin. So it's virtually certain that they were castaways from an unknown shipwreck who died there of probably thirst without having discovered that spring. So just another one of those stories.
What happened to them afterwards? Because the post-rescue story is really quite amazing, especially for George Pollard and Owen Chase.
These days we have counsellors and people who will debrief you from this kind of stuff if anyone has the misfortune to suffer it. Not then. George Pollard went back to sea. He was put in charge of another boat called Two Brothers. He was off Hawaii when he was caught in a bit of a hurricane, and he was wrecked on an uncharted reef called the Florida Shoals. He was picked up, didn't lose a man on that. They were picked up by another whale ship, and then that got wrecked as well. He was heard to lament that this meant he was a Jonah, in other words, an unlucky person at sea, and that he would never command another Nantucket ship again. And so it proved. The air of bad luck surrounding this guy, he's a young guy, by the time he got back to Nantucket was so great that he would never go to sea in any capacity again because no one would have him. So he was appointed Nantucket's night watchman. And apparently every 20th of November, in commemoration of the date that their ship was sunk by the whale, he would lock himself in his room and he would fast. He would refuse all food in memory of his shipmates.
And this is where Herman Melville met him.
It was Owen Chase's son in the centre of the Pacific when Melville himself was serving on a whale ship. And in fact, they were about 200 nautical miles away from the very spot where the Essex went down. And just by chance, when they were having a conversation with another ship in the vicinity, Melville discovered he was talking to the son of Owen Chase, of whom he'd heard all these stories. So he got a copy of Owen Chase's book on the subject. That fired the spark, and of course Melville produced Moby-Dick. Should tell you about Owen Chase. He had a remarkable life, really. He got back from this ordeal and discovered he had a 14-month-old daughter of whose existence he had no suspicion when he left. He sailed as the mate aboard another whaler and then eventually became the captain of another whale ship. He sailed aboard a couple of other whale ships, and then eventually he had enough money to build his own. He was at sea for a further 19 years. The courage of that is mind-blowing, really. He didn't spend much time back in Nantucket. Each time he did, he either discovered he'd had another child or one of his wives had died. 2 wives died while he was at sea. He got home from one of his sea voyages to his 3rd wife and discovered that she had had a baby, nothing unusual in that. But doing the maths, he worked out that that baby had been born 16 months after he sailed. That was the end of that marriage. That's not that tragic, really. What is tragic about this guy is that later in life, he was found to be hoarding food in the attic of his house. He was known to wake up with nightmares and splitting headaches. He was just haunted, as you would be, from this experience for the rest of his life. And he was eventually thrown in an asylum for the mentally infirm when the hoarding behaviour was discovered. And that's where he died.
What sad poignance that is, that affliction, post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever it was, it presented itself in hoarding food. We can understand that, having heard the story.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of our grandparents were pretty parsimonious with food because they'd gotten a little bit short during the Great Depression, and that translated into some pretty strange behaviours later in life. Imagine how much worse it would be if you'd been forced to resort to cannibalism in order to stay alive. Food would become pretty important to you.
Yeah.
Thomas Nickerson, the little cabin boy, he survived. Others didn't. William Wright went whaling and he was drowned in a hurricane. Charles Ramsden was one of the lucky ones. He was a skipper of whale ships until he retired. Benjamin Lawrence, he was lucky as well. He went farming after a successful career as a whaler. Thomas Chappell, the man who set the fire on Charles Island and the Galapagos, he became a missionary. All tortured, blighted souls, you imagine, after this experience. One of the interesting things about it, I guess, is there were 2 main sources for our story on this. We had Thomas Nickerson, who wrote a book that was published not until the 1980s, in fact, and there was Owen Chase, who published a book shortly after he returned to Nantucket. They disagree with themselves, and other survivors disagreed with many particulars as well. So again, there's just this fog of uncertainty, and we'll never know the whole true story.
But if one draws a Venn diagram of the various reports, there's an intersection set there that I think we can be pretty certain of.
Absolutely.
What an appalling tale, but an amazing one of survival as well. The Essex told you it was going to be good. John McCrystal, thank you very, very much.
I like my lot as well as any other.
When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, fellas, it's sure up to be ya. At 7 p.m. a man hatchway gave in. He said, fellas, it's been good to know ya. The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the big ship and crew was in barrel. And later that night, when his lights went in sight, in the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
He last had contact with him and made a talk to him. But about 10 minutes after 7, 1910, and he said he was going along fine and no problem. But it looks from the information that we have that it's fairly certain that the Fitzgerald went down.
Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn in minutes to hours? The searchers all say they have made Whitefish Bay. They put 15 more miles behind her. They might have split up, or they might have capsized. They may have broke even to the water. And all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons of the daughters.
Visually, I had him on a radar. He was exactly 10 miles ahead of us. I asked him how he was making out with his problems, and he said he
for them.
Lake Huron most superior sings in the rooms of her ice water mansion. Old Michigan steams like a young man's dreams, the islands and days of the sportsman. Farther below Lake Ontario, takes in what Lake Erie can center. The iron boats go as the mariners all know, with the gales of November remembered. In a musty old hall in Detroit, they prayed in the maritime sailors' cathedral. The church bell chimed